Hey, welcome to Brandon Sanderson's 2025 Writing Science Fiction Fantasy Lectures. Today, we're going to cover plot, specifically the ideas of promise, progress, and payoff. So I hope you enjoy the lecture. We'll be on plot next week as well. Hey everybody, welcome to class. It's Science Fiction Fantasy Writing. Yay! Because this is a year where we're recording it, I am on the ball and have outlined the rest of the semester for you. So you can see what's coming up. And I guess if you're planning to, go to Aruba one week, you can pick the week you're least engaged by. So there will be 2 guest lectures. Usually I have 2. First one's going to be on the February 6th, and the second one will be on February 27th. So we aren't 100% sure who those people will be yet, but I think maybe we'll try to get indie publishing people. The second one is we are a little closer to the publishing lectures, and we'll see who we bring in for talking about character. So that's what we're going to be doing. Like I told you last time, we're going to go 3 weeks on each topic. And your questions that you write down in take your quiz by 8:45. We will save those for the Q&A lecture. And that's when I will try to dig into those. Usually I get to like 3 of them, and then there's enough questions from the crowd and tangents that I don't answer everything you write down, but it is the nice way that we keep rolling. It does give me a starting point for going into the Q&A lectures. So we're going to do plot first. I kind of go back and forth on where I start. I should say back and forth and further forth, because there's stories are built up generally of 3 things. They're built up of your plot, your setting, and your character. And the intersection of plot, setting, and character is conflict. What you're looking for is how to create that conflict. And as far as stories go, setting, plot, and character all should exist to create some sort of conflict or to facilitate some sort of conflict, because that's what your story is about. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I actually took notes this time. Yes, I know. Look at that. So what's the purpose of plot, right? What do we talk about when we mean plot? I often talk about plot in kind of 2 different categories, and I label them big P plot and little p plot. A capital P plot and a little p plot. Capital P plot is when someone says, "What is your book about?" That's what you tell them. This is what you can boil it down to in a sentence or 2 plot. What is The Lord of the Rings about? It's about a furry-footed British dude taking a magic ring and trying to throw it in a pit, right? That's the funny way of putting it, but you know what I mean. Like, what is The Lord of the Rings about? It's trying to destroy Sauron through destroying this ring that is the conflicts of his power. Little p plot is what happens chapter by chapter in order to keep the reader engaged. So the plot of Lord of the Rings might be destroy the ring, but the lowercase p plot might be, all right, there's some orcs here and we can't get past them. What do we do? Well, we'll dress up like them, right? Like that sort of thing. It's the small little problem and then you resolve it. Small little problem, resolve it, building toward larger problems that you're hopefully resolving. Next week, we're going to talk about plot frameworks. So today, we're not going to talk about the hero's journey or plot archetypes or things like that. Instead, we're going to talk about the general idea of what plot is for. And in my mind, plot is for a couple of things. First is facilitate conflict. It's going to be the primary way that you create conflict in your story. A thing needs to happen, and the characters need to do it, and something is standing in their way. Pretty obvious. The second thing, though, a plot is there to give the reader some structure, to give the reader something to hang on to give them a sense that a story is being told and is moving along. Plot tends to be the one, because of these reasons, that is the most difficult to innovate upon. Plot, setting, and character, I'd say setting is the easiest place to innovate. Character, second easiest. Plot is the most difficult. There are various, and we'll talk about them next week, various plot frameworks, but there's certain things people expect in a satisfying story. And yes, you can subvert those, and most of the ways you would subvert those just makes your story unsatisfying. Now, you may want to tell an unsatisfying story. There are reasons to do that. But in general, you're looking to tell a satisfying story, and there are certain things that work for that and certain things that don't. And because of that, you'll notice that if you go on and start Googling plot and start researching it, people will be like, there's only 3 plots. There's only 7 plots. There's only 1 plot, right? The hero's journey, he would be like, yep, there's 1 plot. It's been told in all these different ways. But he stretched a ton to make that count. I don't know how many plots there are. But I can tell you that innovating here is not necessarily something that needs to be done. In general, if you are combining your plot with interesting characters and an interesting setting, and you are kind of using what we're going to talk about today in this class, you're going to create something that is going to read and it's going to feel fresh and unique, right? It doesn't matter that Dune is Hamlet, right? Is the Lion King, right? Right down to the break in the middle of Lion King and Dune, which I've always found interesting, that both of them are like, we're going to skip all the growing up part, right? Maybe it's because Hamlet, he was already grown, and that Hamlet skipped the whole first half of the story, and it's Hamlet's the second half. But there's something about that story. Son is wronged as father dies and uncle seizes the throne. Son goes away and comes back stronger, maybe crazier in Hamlet's case, and becomes a rival for the uncle's throne, killing the uncle and restoring order to the Pride Lands, or whatever they call them, right? To Arrakis. You would not look at The Lion King and Dune and be like, wow, those are the exact same story, even though the general concept, the general structure is the same structure, right? You've probably, I would guess, never thought that Dune was Hamlet. Everyone talks about Lion King being Hamlet, so you probably already knew that one. But the fact that they share these very similar plot structures, even to the point that it's like the uncle and things like this, doesn't make these stories feel unfresh or unoriginal. In fact, Dune is probably my favorite book of all time. And so because of that, you can use plot as a tool. Plot should be, in my opinion, one of these places where the chef knows what works and can use it to their advantage with only taking pieces and parts. You'll even notice, like, as I said, when Shakespeare wrote this story, to tell the story he wanted to, he started with Hamlet arriving back, right? Well, when Dune tells this story, it backs up and shows all of this and the wrongs being committed that need to be righted. The stories are trying to do different things. And so, in The Lion King, you need cute, plucky animal sidekicks. In Dune, you need an animal that will eat you if you walk without rhythm. So the different needs are different for the different stories. Now, I think that plot breaks down to this idea of promise, progress, and payoff. And all the frameworks we'll talk about next week and the ways of constructing a plot will kind of rely on this same concept. You might be saying to me, Brandon, I am naturally more of a pantser. I like to write by the seat of my pants. I don't like to have a structure. As I mentioned with Stephen King, he feels that if he makes an outline, he's already told his story, and it makes it harder for him to then go tell his story because discovering the story is part of what drives him to write. Don't worry. You can do all of this while discovery writing, right? Now, the frameworks we'll talk about next week, some of those, if you're a discovery writer, you just don't want to use, right? You don't want to sit down and use 7-point story structure. But the more you learn about the core concepts of what makes people read books and enjoy them, the more you can apply that as you're discovering your story. And one thing to be aware of is the difference between discovery writers and outliners, and again, everyone falls on the spectrum between, and indeed most people are a little of both, and it changes based on project. Most people spend about the same amount of time. The outliner spends it up front, the discovery writer spends it on the back end, right? And these sorts of things we're talking about are often really handy tools for analyzing a story that's gone wrong. In fact, that's kind of a theme for this whole class. When you sit down to write, a lot of times writers are not thinking, what is the progress here, right? I do, because that's how I analyze story, but I think most people are writing by instinct. And then if something doesn't work, writers back up and say, all right, what's the disconnect here? And they will often arrive at things that essentially mean, I've made a promise, but my progress is something different. How do I fix that? Well, I go back generally and make new promises, because the progress that I'm writing along is what I want to tell the story about. So don't worry and feel that you have to learn all of this up front and apply it to your outline before you start writing your book. Writing will teach you how to do this better than any other activity will, as we talked about last week. So take all of these things, use them as analytical tools to help you begin understanding story, and if things are broken, then maybe you can analyze them according to some of the things we talk about. And if you're an outliner, they might be really handy in making your outlines. So, questions on any of that before we talk about promises? Yes?
How much of this is just North American culture?
Yeah. So how much of this is I would say Western storytelling traditions, right? But really modern Western storytelling traditions. How much is it? This is a little bit hard for me to put a point on, because definitely in Asia, Japan, Korea, China, you're going to see a different use of payoff most often. That's where they deviate the most. The payoff there, based on kind of subtle storytelling archetypes over time, means something different, and what is satisfying to that audience can be different. That said, they are homogenizing. Whether for good or for ill, you are seeing more and more of ambiguous endings being more popular in the West, and you're seeing more payoff endings in the East, and both are kind of viable. It just depends on what kind of payoff that you want to have. You still generally use, in some of the Eastern styles of storytelling, even going back, if you're going to read Journey to the West, right? You're going to see kind of the same progress and promise methodology. You're just going to see very different payoff methodology. Excellent question. So, yeah, go ahead.
Just out of curiosity, when you're writing something, like when you've been writing something longer, like Stormlight or something, where would you put yourself on the scale between discovery and outliner?
Discovery and outliner. So every author, then the question is, so it can be repeated for the camera, where, like on Stormlight in particular, would I put myself between outliner and pantser, or whatever? Every author is a pantser, is discovery writing at the core as they're working, right? Even if you have bullet points, you're still discovery writing. Like, nobody's outline is as long as their story, so you're always discovery writing something. I remember a famous story that I was told that I have not been able to confirm. I tried very hard, and I think it might just be apocryphal. But the story I was told when I was young is that in the movie E.T., the screenplay just said, Elliot and E.T. escape on the bikes, right? And at least in one of the drafts, and then that became the most iconic scene in the film. A lot of times your outline will say, the characters escape. And then you have to discovery write that, right? So the outliner, it's a bit of a misnomer to call anyone truly an outliner, because it's just how much pantsing you are comfortable with. I tend to fall much more on the outlining side for everything, and the longer the series, the more detailed my outlines are. That is because I'm kind of throwing myself footballs and then trying to catch them 15 years later, right? And the better guess I have where I am, the easier it will be to catch those footballs. That said, I knock out walls that I would have considered load-bearing, and I change things around. And as you write, the story matures. And so even myself, who I consider myself one of the more hardcore outliners that I know, I would say that more discovery writer than outliner in general, just compared to other people I outline more. And here's a fun thing for you. Here's anecdote time, and then I'll get to this question. I have been on many panels on writing, and I generally find myself one of the few outliners. This has changed over time. I find that there are more outliners now than there used to be, but I still tend to be in the minority. And so I talk about myself as kind of being odd sometimes as such a strong outliner. I once sat on a panel in Germany, and I kid you not, I said this and like how I do it, and all the Germans looked at me and they're like, no, that's how it's done. I'm like, no, there's discovery writing. They're like horrified. They're like, people do that without a structure? I thought it was funny. It's a little bit of stereotype, but it literally happened that all the Germans are like, it's insane to not have an outline. All right, question here, and then we'll do this one, then we'll do, yeah.
How do you come to terms with dropping plots or plans that you feel are core to your story?
How do you come to terms with dropping plots or plans that you feel are core to your story? How do you come to terms with killing your darlings, which is a famous screenwriting terminology for this sort of thing? You tell yourself a lie, okay? I'm going to tell you what the lie is. I will find a much better place for this character, plot, or idea where it can shine in its own story. And then 9 times out of 10 you won't, because that idea actually wasn't that great. You just built the whole story upon it. The story then evolved, because the process of building a story is where the real creativity takes off. And as you start writing it, you start applying all of your ideas, and that thing that started you actually is not as good as the rest of it, and part of you realizes it. Once in a while, that 1 out of 10, that lets you have plausible deniability on your lie. Once in a while, that 1 out of 10 becomes its own story, and it deserves that space and time. I will say this, just as a blanket, I almost always throw away my first chapters, often my first several chapters of a given book, and write them over once I'm finished. This is how you can tell, even though I'm an outliner, discovery writing and really focusing on the progress side of this, which is in many ways the most important, but the least showy, right? It's the one that people will pay attention to the least, but it's 90% of your book. Once you know what that progress is, you then know how to signpost that for people to enjoy it, and throwing away your early chapters is really common in the industry. So this is one of the reasons why it's best not to become, where's Nate? Not to become an eternal, hey, you were right there, and I just looked past you. Not to learn as Nate has done, to not keep revising your first chapters until you've finished your book, because for most of us, you won't really be able to do that until you've gotten far enough along to know how to make those promises. So thank you for being 2 years running my really great example on this. So, all right, I'm going to go into promises, then we will do more Q&A, okay? So, promises. Promises are the easy one, okay? You should not stress promises at the beginning of your book, because once you learn your progress and once you've written an ending, and if you're a discovery writer, it'll be a bad ending. Don't stress that either. Once you know what the core of your book is about, throwing away 3 chapters and rewriting it so that your promise nails what you want to do in your story is easy. throwing away 40 chapters in the middle is hard, right? If you just look at the weight of time. So, but promises in many ways are the most important. They're the easiest, but most important. Why are they most important? Well, you might have heard people talk about how important your hook or your first line is and things like that. I find rarely do first lines actually matter. We like to talk about them. Usually it's your first couple of pages that really matter. And yes, a zinger of a first line can be really great, right? You know, well, what is the great ones? You can go look at some of the great ones. What's that?
Call me Ishmael.
Call Me Ishmael is a really great first line. Snow Crash has a really great first line. You know, 1984 has a really great first line, right? Like there's a bunch of really great first lines. They're awesome. Having one of those is worth doing. But really, your first chapter, your first few pages, they are important because that's where someone's going to decide whether or not to put your book down. And that's dangerous. And it's also dangerous for you because most of the books you read, the authors are actually relying on something before the first line to not make you put the book down. And that is the name on the title, right? So when you pick up The Way of Kings and you read The Way of Kings, I can get away with so much in that book because I'm trading on my name and popularity, right? Like, how do I pitch Way of Kings? I say, this is the book to read once you trust me. You might trust me because your friend won't leave you alone and wants you to read it. You might trust me because you've tried a different book. Once you trust me, you can read The Way of Kings. It has 3 prologues. That's a terrible idea. Don't do that. Right? Only one of them's named prologue, but I cheated and named one prelude, right? And then the next chapter is a prologue also. It's just called chapter 1. It really is. If you haven't seen it, that's the one from the eyes of the kid who's on the battlefield. It's not even, a main character, right? So don't do that unless what you are willing to get how should I say? Unless you're willing for people to just put your book down. You got a question on this?
I do with promises. How?
Yeah.
In larger series.
Yes.
How do you keep promises between books?
How do you keep promises between books? Yeah.
People between books, and you can't do that by making a promise each book.
Yes, you can. You can make it the promise each book, but a lot of times it depends on the structure of your story. All right? A lot of romance novels do this by saying, here is whole family of unmarried, young, eligible people. Book 1's about the eldest. Guess what book 2 is about, right? Inherent structure. You can promise that in your first chapter if you do it right so that everyone knows, it's going to be a 7-book series because there's 7 girls, right? And then there's cousins, so we're going to keep going. That's how you know if a series made money, if the cousins start getting married. I'm joking, but it's real. But you can also do that, like if you are an established author, there's a promise that this is the first of a trilogy. People are picking it up. The actual packaging of the book can give you your promise of sort of structure. In the Wheel of Time, Robert Jordan promises at the end of this book series, the Dragon Reborn will fight the Dark One. He said he'd get there in 3 books when he pitched it to Tom Doherty. I have that straight from Harriet, his wife. He thought he could do it in 3 books. And the first book was going to end with him taking the sword that was not a sword from the stone that's not a stone. Right? If you've read the series, that's book 3. And then it just got longer from there. Discovery writers. This is what happens when discovery writers get series. But he made that promise, right? Oftentimes, if you have a big series, it can be really handy to make one of the kinds of promises. The kinds of promises can be, this is a large continuing story, and there's something cool at the end. It can be, here are 7 sisters. It can be, these are the continuing adventures of said character. Then you just name your series something like the blank and blank files, or the blank and blank the Dresden Files are a great example of this, right? Then each one is going to be a self-contained adventure. That's your promise, right? You can do all of these things, but may you be so lucky as to have to worry about this. Let's talk about the promises you should be worrying more about right now, because you're going to be looking at making a couple of big promises in the beginning of your story, and they aren't all innately obvious. The first is, you often want to make a tone promise, okay? A tone promise is separate from the plot promises that you're otherwise making. What is a tone promise? Well, a tone promise is a way to tell the reader, this is the kind of story you're getting into. And this is the sort of feel that it's going to have. If your story is going to involve a lot of humor, you want there to be jokes early on. If this is a story about tragedy and it being grimdark, well, you start your story with a viewpoint protagonist who gets beheaded by someone who doesn't want to kill him, right? Game of Thrones, right? Right? If you want, you give a tone promise through descriptions. Naming your characters the Stark family is a tone promise that George Martin made in those books. Whereupon, if you're going to name your wizard school Hogwarts and your Gandalf is named Dumbledore, you are giving a promise of whimsy, right? And things like this. The way that you're naming things, the way you're introducing your stories, the way you're using your prose in your opening is going to give someone an important promise about what your story is about. This is why the prologue became a really big thing in epic fantasy, because epic fantasy wanted to start its plot slow. Epic fantasy generally leans into this sort of progression fantasy that is, like a lot of the lit RPGers do this very explicitly these days. If you don't know what that is, it's a very popular genre, particularly in indie publishing, where your characters have like bars of experience bars and level and things like that, like they're in a video game. But most epic fantasy is the story of the young nobody who ends up saving the world. I wouldn't say most, but a large number of the very popular ones. It's the traditional hero's journey sort of thing. Those stories tend to start with a young person standing and looking up at the suns and imagining a world beyond, right? But because of that, that's not the tone of the whole story. The tone of the whole story is we're getting chased by space wizards and things are exploding. So what do these stories do? They add a prologue that is basically there to give you a tone promise. We start with the door being blasted off and laser fire and a dark samurai coming through the smoke and, using magical powers. And then we cut to young, idealistic everyman standing and being like, wow, what's beyond the stars? The answer is space wizards and lasers. But you know that and he doesn't yet. One of the most masterful uses of this is Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time, which is going to start with a young man on a farm, and things are going to feel creepy, right? It does feel creepy, but the main story is the story of what happens if you get too much power and you might kill everyone that you love, but you need that power to save the world. That is the basic premise. So what does he do? Prologue. Hey, there's a person who has all this power, but has gone crazy and killed everyone he loves. Right? You will see this very commonly as one of your ways to make a tone promise, to the point that it's almost a cliche now, so you need to be using it carefully. Don't do it just because it's done. Do it because your story really benefits from it, and be aware that if there are lots of people doing it, then it's harder to stand out doing it. That said, I did it in Stormlight. I didn't in Mistborn, right? I use that kind of tone promise prologue for different reasons. That's why Stormlight has two prologues. Here's one tone for the whole series. Melancholy about these people who've been immortal and things are falling apart. Next tone promise. Hey, assassinations and wars. And then, yeah. So, what's that? Yes, and then try number 3. Oh, the poor kid on the battlefield. That's going to come back, isn't it? Hey, yes. I knew why I did each of those prologues, but yeah, it is a lot. It is a lot to swallow. So, other reasons, things that your promises you're going to make. Some stories choose, and you don't need to do this, but some stories choose to do an opening, what we call a cold open, which is actually what Star Wars is too, starting in medias res right at the beginning. But they often will do this little mini story at the beginning, and the purpose of this is to say, here is our story in microcosm. We're going to do it in 5 or 15 pages, and then we're going to do it in 150 pages. Indiana Jones loved to do this, right? The first one is really excellent at this. Indiana Jones, cool adventurer, gonna overcome trials. It's gonna be really hard for him, but he's gonna use his wits and his whip to overcome these, and at the end, he's gonna lose. Right? That is the opening to Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. And then the rest of the movie is the exact same thing, done a second time at length in slightly different ways. You will see this used pretty commonly as your sort of promise of here's what my story is. Often when you have a cold open, that's what the cold open is for. Here's our characters pulling a heist so you can know how good they are at pulling heists. And then we're going to use that either to replicate it or something's going to go wrong with the next heist so you knew how it's supposed to go. And then this whole story is about what happens when it goes wrong. Excellent ways to kind of introduce your characters and things like that. Sometimes your opening does that. A lot of times you want your opening to give you a promise of what the plot of the story is going to be, even if you don't do it in microcosm. You want to introduce some metaphor for the main conflict. And this is difficult sometimes because sometimes your main conflict won't come until much later. Sometimes it will. For instance, Star Wars, hey, it's right up there. We need to get the Death Star plans. We're going to blow up the Death Star. Boom. In the cold open and in the tone promise, you've got it all. Sometimes, though, you don't, right? Like, what is Lord of the Rings? Are we going to find out the plot of Lord of the Rings? Well, it kind of has the mini thing. You gather your group of friends. It's really hard. You get to this place. That's Rivendell, and then you do it again, and it takes 3 books that time. But a lot of times your character is like not going to discover what the big problem is until around the end of Act 3 if you're using the act structure. This is a problem for giving a promise about the plot. What do? Well, sometimes you just let the tone promise handle it. Sometimes you spend those opening things saying, here's the tone of the book, here's my character and why you should like them. Now we'll introduce a problem that is really hard to overcome. And that is fine. You don't have to promise all of these things. Sometimes you try to find a mini way to introduce what the character's conflict or the main conflict might be in that opener. What am I talking about with these sorts of things? Well, sometimes you will read a book or see a film where a character is trying to fix a broken down hunk of junk. And then, the Transformers movies do this. It's about, I need a car, Dad. Car. Oh, it's hard. I found this car. Well, the movie's going to be about cars and getting cars. And you kind of have this little mini introduction to what the character wants and why they can't have it. And this is really kind of what you're introducing in this opener if you're trying to get to kind of your character promises is what do they want? What do they need? Why can't they have it? And you can kind of start there and then throw the capital P plot at them at the end of Act 1. As long as your lowercase p plot kind of either gives a promise of tone or is in microcosm some sort of picture, small snapshot of the larger picture that is going to become the book. This is why all of this can be done pretty easily in retrospect, right? Once you know where you're going, you can start making these promises a lot easier. So I'm going to go off of promises for a second, but I'm going to let you ask me questions first, and I'm going to look and see what, yes. I think I got to it all, yeah.
What about just skipping the entire first part of your story altogether?
Yeah, it's done. It's done. Anything can be done, and it can be done well, right? I just referenced Hamlet. Hamlet essentially skips of what most people would do. It skips Act 1. of this very classic story that I would be willing to bet during Shakespeare's time, because this is how Shakespeare worked, he had heard that story. I mean, it's a really common story to be telling, the prince who has to reclaim his kingdom from the person who overthrew it. He'd heard that story, and then he chose to skip Act 1 and start with Act 2, which is weird. I'm talking story structure act, not playwriting acts, which are different in that case, right? Same terminology, but they mean different things. So this happens all the time. You've probably seen many a story. Monkey Island 2 does this. Well, there's a deep cut, Monkey Island, where you have a character start with some interesting thing happening, and then the record scratch, you're probably wondering how I got here. Emperor's New Groove, right? Right? And then they tell Act 1 in flashback, catching you up to oftentimes the middle of Act 2 or sometimes even the end of Act 2. And then they launch into, that. You've probably seen that. But there are plenty of stories like Hamlet that just say, pick it up from context. We aren't doing Act 1. We're in the middle of a story. In fantasy, I would say that the Malazan Book of the Fallen loves to do this. Just like, boom, we're going. Figure out where we are if you can. So, yeah, totally doable. Yeah.
What if you switch between tones back and forth deliberately, like from more of a thriller tone to kind of a travelogue and then back into a thriller as the story progresses?
Yeah, excellent question. What do you do if you are going to be switching between tones? Your example being a pretty good one of travelogue, thriller, travelogue, thriller. So you can promise both of that at the beginning, and I would really suggest that you do. You can do anything. You don't have to give any promises. Famously, the big breaker of all of these rules is Into the Woods. If you haven't seen Into the Woods, it starts off, it's like, here's all these people on their adventures, and then promises are stomped flat when you come back from the intermission. Goodbye promises, sometimes literally, stomped flat. And the thing about that is he very cleverly does something we're going to talk about in twists, where he makes you want the tone to change. And so oftentimes there's that. But with this sort of story, you could make promises at the beginning, something in microcosm that's like, this story is about these kinds of things. It's always more difficult. More difficult things make you grow. And if you do them right, when you break the rules, here's kind of a rule of thumb that you could therefore break. I don't know. Here's a rule of thumb. Things that break the rules have a harder, a bigger threshold to overcome to grab the reader's attention. But once they do, they tend to have a stronger and more dedicated following, right? Blandness tends to get fewer dedicated followers, whereas something that is doing what it shouldn't, but makes it work, tends to, when it gets big, tends to be very big. And this is a reason why, for instance, there are within some genres, let's use romance. Within romance, there are some very formulaic stories that people still read and love, right? But they don't really capture people. You read them, you dispose of them, you read the next one, you dispose of them. The ones that break the rules a little bit, It Ends With Us is a great example of this. It's not really a romance novel, but kind of is, but kind of isn't. Suddenly, when those take off, they can take off really big because they are standing out. They are breaking those rules, but they take more inertia. I always say, I'll get to you, but I got a question back there after this. I always say that books, all of them have like these certain red marks against them, right? And every great book has a ton of these. Your job is not to get rid of all the red marks. A red mark being something that would make someone put the book down, make it harder to get into. Your job is to get rid of the ones that aren't integral to the piece of art you're making. And then you try to rely on the ones that are integral, you can't get rid of, to be things that also distinguish it. Way of Kings has 3 prologues. What does Way of Kings get from that? Well, it's really hard to get into. If you're going to put down the Way of Kings, most of my books, if you read the 1-star reviews, they're very different for the Way of Kings. The 1-star reviews just could not get through the first 10 chapters. Too much going on, too many names, too many characters, and Carlton is way too depressed, right? But because of that, I can start really low and go really high. I can then world build so much that when it all clicks together and you get it, it's so distinctive and interesting, it's not like anything you've read. I'm able to do things with this red mark that you could not do with a book that didn't have it. So as long as you are using them to their fullest, yes, they will break the rules. Right now, to sell in fantasy, they say we want 120,000 words, traditional published. Way of Kings is 400, right? Elantros was 250 when I submitted, and I got down to 200. As long as you're earning that 200, then suddenly it becomes, does that make sense? So yeah. Let's go back here and then up here, and then we'll see where we are. There was one back there in the corner, and I didn't want to ignore you because it's hard to see. So, yeah.
About promises, and like you said that the first 3 chapters are easy to, edit after the fact. Do you find you're also editing a lot in the middle, keeping up with the promises that you found you've made at the end?
Well, that's more progress. We'll talk about progress next. So I'm glad you asked that. I'm not doing as much. Mostly I'm trying to make the ending and the promise match what is the interesting parts of the middle is really what I'm shooting for. But I'm a bad example in this because I generally know my ending. So my progress and my ending usually align pretty well. It's just nailing the right promise at the beginning is much easier after I've actually written that ending. All right, down here.
How do promises scale with like the length of the story? Like say you have like a shorter story, like
Yeah.
your installment in like a
Yeah.
anthology. How does that scale?
So how do promises scale with length of the story? The example being you've got a smaller piece, maybe part of an anthology or a short story. So in a short story, and maybe we'll try to get Eric in during one of the weeks I'm gone to talk short stories, everything just has to be trimmed down, but it also has to be distilled. It's not just a matter of writing shorter, it's writing in a more distilled way. So you still need to hit that promise. In some ways, you need to hit it harder, because it does need to be like in your first paragraph in the short story, rather than the fantasy book where you can spend a whole prologue giving us a tone promise and then switch characters. You just can't do that in a short story, right? Or you can do anything, but in most short stories, I wouldn't recommend it. So therefore, what you're trying to do is you're hitting it just really hard. In a long story, you can do what I did and have 3 separate chapters doing 3 separate promises, right? Before you even start your book. Readers will look at the length of your book and they will determine how long they'll give you to start getting around to it based on that length. Yeah.
Can you and should you make new promises as you progress through the story?
Can you and should you make new promises as you progress through the story? The answer is yes and yes, asterisks, right? It depends on how long your story is, and it depends on what kind of twists you're going for. Most stories will be making new promises. You'll be introducing a new character, and you're going to make a promise about that character usually. Every character is going to have some innate promises attached to them. Usually this is with their character arc, right? And we'll talk about this in probably actually Sanderson's second law. But the idea is you're going to attach to them flaws, handicaps, and challenges, right? And you're going to you're going to figure out you're going to signpost which of those are going to be overcome, which of them are going to be expunged, where the character is going to grow or fail to grow, right? And so every character's, but each little plot sequence will often have a promise. In fact, every chapter generally has one. Oftentimes chapters, just like, unfortunately, as frustrating as it is to go back to your high school classes, your teacher's like, thesis paragraph. A lot of the best chapters start with a stealth thesis paragraph that introduces what the chapter is going to be about and what you're going to learn. And then at the end, we'll have a stinger of a line that indicates, now you've learned it, right? But it depends on the type of plot that you have. We'll get to that in progress. All right, where are we? I need to move to progress. We're going to move to progress. If there's time at the end, I'll take more questions. But we got progress, and progress is the most important of them. And so save your question, and when I do questions at the end after payoffs, you can reference back, okay? But let's talk progress. All right. So, my notes. Yes, notes. So, you absolutely control progress in your story to a greater extent than you think. It's pretty easy to explain this, right? At any point in your story, let's say you're writing a romance, you could write, he stopped being stupid and so they got together and got married, the end. At any point, you can just write that. At any point, Tolkien could have written, Bilbo fell through a wormhole, appeared in Mordor, and dropped the ring into the thing, and everyone was saved, right? You've maybe read stories where at the ending, a writer rushed this a little too much, and you felt a little bit like Frodo had been dropped through the wormhole, right? We call that a deus ex machina, right? You control time and progress absolutely in your story. You as a writer, I could give you the challenge right now to say, all right, you need to spend 50 pages and only 1 second can pass. It would be really boring, but you could all do it, right? You just describe everything in the room, right? And then get into philosophy. It's in the character's head, and then do a flashback or whatever. You could 50 pages and 1 second has passed. I bet you've read books that feel like that before. Those of you who like manga, I hear there's lots of filler chapters sometimes. Yeah. So you can also be like, and 1,000 years passed. I've read books that use structures like this, right? You control time, you control progress. So your job as a writer is not to make things progress. It is to give a sense of satisfying progression through a story. And you do this by deciding a couple of things. First is how fast your progress is going to be. Your short story is going to go faster. You're also going to, if you're writing, say, a thriller, you're writing a story where a lot of the opposition is external, obstacles to overcome. Characters got to fight this, grab this, get to this place, right? I mean, Tenet is this. It's almost all external, and it's the next problem, the next problem, the next problem. Those stories are paced very differently from the story about a character wrestling with whether or not it's right to kill your uncle, or how you would kill your uncle, and if you'd even make a good king, or how awful it is that you're driving your girlfriend and saying, like, all of this stuff. You're wrestling with all of this, right? That has a very different pacing. You're going to decide kind of how your pacing is, and it's nice to match it to your story and to your own natural writing style. So, how fast you want to go. The most important thing you'll probably decide is what kinds of progress you're going to make and how you're going to signpost that to the reader. So, this is a little bit of a hard one to explain, so give me some time on this. There are lots of different types of progress you can make in a story, and you want to generally match that to what your climax is going to be. For instance, if you are telling what is basically a mystery plot, which doesn't mean you're writing a mystery, but your plot is based around characters lacking information and needing to find this information, and your ending is going to involve a big informational reveal. The mystery story is obviously the best example of this, right? A whodunit. We have a murder. We know somebody did it. We don't know who it is. The detective is going to, over time, sort through and discover clues, and at the end, reveal who did it. Information style plot, right? A lot of stories have mysteries built into them. In these cases, your progress is measured by information. What clues have been given, what suspects have been discovered, and which ones have been eliminated. You therefore often want to find ways to signpost that progress is being made. You can do this in a lot of ways. If it's a mystery, the detective is saying, I've almost got this. I feel like I'm so close. You will watch a lot of mystery stories do this. We're getting closer. We're almost there. We need but one more piece, Watson, right? And there are these signposts that are saying you are getting there. And you are at the same time giving this information to the reader. A relationship plot, which buddy cop movies and romantic comedies follow the same structure for these, right? It's just whether there's a fist bump or a kiss at the end. In these sorts of stories, what you're going to be doing is the relationship is going to be making progress. You're going to start off with a very clear indication these people do not get along. And then you're going to show ways that they do. But then there's going to be backsteps occasionally. But then you're going to, through the course of the story, be like, wow, these two people work better together than they ever did apart. They are filling holes in each other's lives. And so when they finally get together, that's your climax. And the trick with this is stories often have multiples of these going on at the same time that are different things. And identifying which is the most important to your story and therefore the key component to your ending is actually really important. Guardians of the Galaxy is ostensibly an adventure story about get the MacGuffin and prevent the world from ending. But the real story is, can these people work together? And almost everything that is not an action scene, and even some of the action scenes, is a relationship plot. And so that movie really cleverly has its climactic moment being where the main character, who's refused to take his mom's hand when she wanted to give him a hug when she was dying, takes the hand of his friends, and they all take each other's hands, and then together, that, with a dance battle, is what beats the bad guy, right? It is not necessarily that, the MacGuffin beats the bad guy. It is literally the power of friendship that defeats the bad guy. And that when a plot really works, that's what happens. And to do this, what gets really tricky is you sometimes have to identify the difference between kind of the trappings of your story and your A plot and your B plot and what people are going to think they are. Guardians is a great example. People, ostensibly, your big P plot is actually get the MacGuffin. Chase down the MacGuffin, get the MacGuffin, clear our names, to prevent the world from being destroyed. But the actual little p plot is character, is can we get along? Can we become friends? And so you're going to have multiples of these, and usually you want to pay them off all together. You just kind of have to decide what your soul of your story is. The longer your story, the more souls of your story that you can have. And often you can introduce things like this, have a whole arc about people, becoming friends, and then go into Act 3 and solve the MacGuffin problem. Guardians of the Galaxy doesn't do this, doesn't write on top of each other, but you can do things like that. You've probably read stories where, for instance, Moana has a sub-arc for Maui in the middle of it. It's handled, that's a really good movie, but it's handled kind of clunkily with Maui's return. But they're trying to do this, right? They're trying to have we're not going to do this at the main climax, just right before it. So Maui has his character climax and comes back and things like this. So figuring out and identifying what your various plots are and how you're going to make them all have a sense of progress is really vital, I think, for making a story work. A page turner is usually a story that really understands progress and how to dole it out. A boring book, when people get, when you don't write it on purpose like I did. Those who aren't laughing, I literally released a book called The Most Boring Book Ever last year. It was a kid's book, though. A book that people like boring or I got lost, usually the signposts of progress are not there. Now, a big reason the signposts of progress cannot be there is that you gave someone a really interesting promise. And then you as a writer got really interested in something else and you have a giant subplot going somewhere else that doesn't seem to advance the main story. The Last Jedi does this. As a film. Last Jedi does this, and so what happens is Finn as a character has been introduced to us in the first movie and then reintroduced to us in the second movie as a guy who cares about his friend Rey and really wants to go find her and help her. And then the plot says, you know, I did promise that, but what if you let some horses go free? What if you really needed to learn that horses should be free? And Finn's like, my friend Rey, the fate of the universe, Luke Skywalker, blah, 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 I want to go to my friend Rey. And the plot's like, but those horses. And not everyone had this experience, but it was a lot of people. And it was the experience I had. I'm like, why are we here? What are we doing? I am not feeling that this is progressing the promises made to me by this story. And so whatever is interesting happening there, we don't invest in. I had this problem in Oathbringer, where I'll try to explain it without giving too many spoilers. I had a plot. I'm going to draw on the board for you. A little harder to draw on the board in this one. All right. Oh, I'm supposed to use black because the camera can pick it up better. So you all know to take your quiz. It's already passed, right? No. It's 7:45, not 8:45. Yeah. It's all passed. You all fail. So sorry. Come back next year. So I had a story where characters were right here. And I knew they needed to be right there, right? Characters all are kind of set adrift. They don't know what they're doing. They're in a new environment. They land here, and they all are like, well, if we can get to this place, then we can get out of here. And so they all make a plan to go to this place, and then I have them going there, and then they get diverted by something. And then they get diverted, and whoa, they end up where I knew they needed to be all along. Readers were so bored with this plot. Right? Which was shocking to me because the new environment that I put them in, I'd done a lot of world building. The sort of things that make my stories pop, I had put in there. This is why, we will talk about it, world building is actually the least important of the three. It is, I'm sorry. Great world building with a bad characters and bad plot is an encyclopedia. Right? Great characters and great plot with bad world building is still often an excellent book. You can probably name them. The fact that time termers break the entire universe of Harry Potter wide open does not prevent that from being the strongest book in the entire series. Right? Right? So, world building's important, don't get me wrong. You ideally want to do all three. But really great world building cannot save a sequence where you have said, hey, people need to go to point B, and then you send them to point C, because the whole time, the readers will be thinking, this is a side quest. And we are being diverted from our story until we start heading toward point B, where we'll be making progress again. Because we are making no progress, I will not invest in this plot cycle because it doesn't seem like it means anything. My solution was actually pretty easy. My solution was to have the primary viewpoint protagonist of this, right near the beginning, be put in conflict with the rest of the group because he's been told by a source that he believes that if he doesn't get to point C, someone he loves will die. And he believes that so strongly, and he's the main character we're seeing through the eyes of right here, or at least one of them, that suddenly it's a conflict. It's like, oh, are we supposed to go to B or C? Oh, I think we need to get to C because the consequences of not getting to C, if this character is right, are really, really, really dire. So even though he's in conflict with them, it works. And suddenly that little change, and suddenly the whole plot sequence worked. In the next group of readers, nobody had problems. Everybody was enjoying it. All the things that I wanted to have happen, wanted to be enjoyed, were enjoyed. Such little changes and promises. You see how whoever asked, you want to make promises? I made another promise in the middle of the story. Promise is, if you don't get here, something bad will happen. And so he needs to get there. And so you can see how just little diversions with really interesting things can end up not working if you don't understand progress payoff. Most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time if a book is boring, or if people aren't investing in a sequence that you thought they should invest in, you have made a misalignment of progress and promise.
How consistent should we be with pacing throughout the book?
It depends on your own personal style. Question is, how consistent should you be on pacing? It really, really depends, right? Generally, if you want to use thriller pacing, which is you're going to write short chapters, you're going to try to put a hook at the end of every one of them, or at least most of them. Dan Brown is pretty good at this, for all his faults. He's really good at this, and that's part of what made the Da Vinci Code work, is that short chapters with a hook at the end of each one and a lot of external conflict can really propel a story, but they run out, in my experience, right around 70,000 words. And if you're not going right into the climax then, you start to lose people. So it works really great for a story that's 90 to 100,000 words long. Really hard to keep that up for too long because you generally in a book want slowdowns in pacing for the reader to get a breather, for the characters to get a breather, and for you to kind of come to process what's been discovered, so that then you can ramp it back up because variation is noticeable. And lack of variation creates sort of a sense that you're coasting along and it starts to lose its impact. If every sentence is a one-sentence zinger, then none of them, right? What's that syndrome said? If everyone has superpowers, nobody does, or something like that, right? If everyone's super, nobody is? Yeah, there you are. Sorry, Brad Bird, misquoting you. So there is an example of why you would want to do both. But if you can keep it up, like a lot of things that people are like, this is an absolute page turner. It's 80 to 100,000 words of just relentless plotting that you're supposed to read in one sitting and not stop. I don't do that in the Stormlight Archive, right? I did it a little bit in Wind and Truth, which is why the pacing feels different in Wind and Truth than it does in other books. So it's really kind of up to you what you want to do with this. Generally, no, you don't want the same pacing through a book. Generally, you want to change pacing and have breathers and things like this. It's up to you. Some books are just really slow the whole time. And that's just the author's writing style, right? So, yeah, excellent question. Go ahead.
Yeah, how do you deal with speeding up progress when you want the characters to get to a destination, but you don't want to take time with the traveling?
Right. How do you speed up progress when you want to not have to take time traveling? I would give a mini promise early in your book that sometimes you're just going to time jump. And then just time jump. Just say, and then they arrived. And you can do this pretty easily. Like if you're having problems with people being like, it feels like I missed too much. End part one, and then start part two with them having arrived. Stuff like this, like actual structural physicality breaks. Like if you break a chapter and then say 3 weeks later, so much easier for a reader than if you try to, in the middle of a chapter, say, and 3 weeks passed. That said, Joe Rowling does it all the time in Harry Potter. And 3 weeks passed, and it was Christmas time now. And so I don't think you have to worry about this as much as you think you do. As long as you've kind of established early on that you're gonna, like if you even have one chapter that says at the end of chapter 2 and then chapter 3 is like 3 days later, X, you've already established this as a pattern. And nobody should ever have a problem with sometimes you even do it right at the end of a chapter. You're like, over the next 3 days, she kept worrying that something was going to happen, but at last they crested the hill and saw, boom, and you've done it in a paragraph. So, yeah. Back here, and then we'll do some of you up here.
So you said that proper pacing, proper progress, signposting.
Yeah.
But you also warned against not making promises you aren't going to keep. So how is the key to a good plot twist proper signposting?
So we'll talk about plot twists and payoff in a second, but yes, that's part of it. The real good thing, the secret to proper twists is generally to promise someone something and then make them wish you'd promised something else. All right? So to explain this, we'll do some others, but to explain this, since the question is here, I imagine twists working like you promised someone a gift for Christmas, and you say, you like toy cars? I'm going to get you a toy car. And then you put a package under the Christmas tree. And the twist is, what do they actually open? Plenty of stories give you a toy car. And there is nothing wrong with that, right? One of the greatest books of all time is Pride and Prejudice. What is the first line of Pride and Prejudice?
Is it truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession
Yeah.
of fortune must be
Yeah. First line is, this is a book about someone getting married, right? And then, oh, twist. Nope, there's no twist. They get married, right? There's complications and escalations, which are different from twists and equally important, in fact, even more important. You do not have to have a twist. However, if you want a twist, as was guessed earlier here, one of the things you can do is you can escalate, you can over deliver. You promised a toy car, you give them a real car, right? But one of the classic twists is you say, I'm going to get you a toy car. They're like, yay! And then through the course of the story, you show them how cool planes are. To the point that they're like, I know I'm going to get a toy car, but boy, I wish I was getting a toy plane. And then you give them a toy plane. I usually use an example, the movie While You Were Sleeping. I'm going to spoil While You Were Sleeping. I'm sorry. Okay? Yeah, it's a fantastic film that uses twist perfectly in this sort of style. It's a romance. Woman is like dreaming, seeing this guy pass through her toll booth, because she works at like a toll booth on the freeway, and thinking, that's the guy someday I'd like to marry, and she blah, 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 blah. And then like he gets in a car wreck, and she's there, and she like helps him, and he wakes up, and she tells a lie, because she's like, oh, I'm his girlfriend, but not really meaning to tell that lie. She just was, dreaming it, or I'm his fiance. And then everyone's like, he had a secret fiance. Oh no. She's like, oh no, now everyone thinks I'm his fiance. I don't want to let them down. Hijinks ensue, right? And so this story is about, I'm pretending to be his fiance because he's lost his memory and things like this, or he's in a coma and then he's whatever, right? In the meantime, while he's in a coma, / wakes up and has lost his memory, because there's your escalation, right? Rather than a twist, it's escalation. What's going to happen when he wakes up and the lie becomes revealed? Oh, he doesn't remember. I had a fiance. Oh, wow, she's pretty. Oh, that's good. Right, like, I'm glad my secret fiance is Sandra Bullock. Right? In the meantime, through the whole time, this is not uncommon, right? I think The Wedding Singer does the same thing. She's been hanging out with his brother and falling in love with his brother. That's the airplane, right? You find out they match each other really well, and she doesn't actually match this other guy at all. Even though you were promised a toy car in scene 1, you, through the course of the film, really come to want a toy plane. And then, of course, the ending is she ends up with the plane, with the brother, right? Right? The hijinks continue to ensue until they, go to comical and ridiculous. Well, they start at comical and ridiculous proportions. They go further than that. And then, boom, the wrap up. And the twist is you get your plane. It's pretty well signposted that you're getting your plane, but there are plenty of books that do this more subtly. Not that While You're Sleeping is bad for not doing it subtly. It's a really excellent story. But you can do that more subtly so that the twist is, oh, wow, this is what I always wanted. And this is actually the secret to why Into the Woods works. Because Into the Woods shows you idyllic fairy tales in the beginning and then starts to put cracks in them so that you start to not necessarily want the fairy tale ending. And then boom, second act happens and everything gets smashed to splinterings, but then it's rebuilt as something better so that it ends up working. It's a really gutsy move, and a lot of people really dislike Into the Woods for that reason. Like my mom does not like Into the Woods. She's just like, give me a fairy tale. That's what you promised. You lied to me, Sondheim. I'm never watching any of your plays again, mostly because they're about people eating other people or assassinating people. And then there's West Side Story. But she'll watch that one. Sorry. Does that make sense? Yeah, how much time we got? We got 5 minutes. Okay. All right. We got to do promises. Write your questions in here. Let's just do payoffs for a little bit. I've already done the most important one, which is what do you do with twists, right? But payoffs are really just giving people a surprising yet inevitable fulfillment of your promises. You make it surprising through a couple of ways. One is the twist. But usually what you do to make it surprising is you give them plausible deniability. You make them believe that it won't happen. And most stories get a lot of mileage out of this, right? Like a ton of mileage out of making the story work so well that you worry, you wonder. If the character, you're like, oh, is the character actually going to succeed? You know, we're pretty sure that Frodo is going to succeed and that the world is not going to end. But then when he gets stung by Shelob and dies, you're like, wait, maybe Frodo won't. Maybe Sam will have to do this all by himself. That's horrifying, right? Escalation. And then we get Frodo back. But then Frodo collapses. Then Sam has to carry him, right? Like things like this, like you keep getting these obstacles, escalations. And through obstacles, escalations, and the last one being red herrings, you manage to make people think that they aren't going to get what you promised them, then you do anyway. That is your basic. That's what you generally do. The twist works really well also. Sometimes your surprising yet inevitable is built around this idea that as you're going through your story, you forget the promise, right? My favorite of the Lord of the Rings films is the second film, where the promise is, right at the end, look for me on the morning of the fifth day, right? And this is a beautiful sequence. And this will kind of be where I'll wrap up. I love the second movie, and I like the third movie. I like the Frodo-Sam part. But the Battle of Helm's Deep versus the Minas Tirith battle, they work on very different axes, and it's all about promises, right? In the Minas Tirith battle, in the third film, because the plays out slightly differently in the books, so I use the films because they make a better object lesson. And this is in the third film, Minas Tirith, they're up against all odds. They are going to be destroyed. And the promise is, if they don't, fight this off themselves, they will fail. This is their last resort. And then they fight, and they're really strong, and they can't do it. And then Aragorn shows up and saves them. In the second film, it's the same thing. They're in this bastion. It's their last resort. If they don't win this, they're all going to die. And then Gandalf shows up and saves them. The difference in these plot cycles is promises. In the second film, Gandalf says, look for me on the morning of the fifth day. And Peter Jackson very expertly uses, what's his name? Is it Yomer? Yeah, it's Yomer. Yomer, yeah. I was going to say Faramir, it's not Faramir, it's Yomer. And I was going to say, it's Bones, but it's not Bones, it's Yomer, because he's in a different movie. But he very expertly has them leave. It doesn't work this way in the books, but the expert has them leave, so you have hanging on the mantle there this idea of, there's an army out there that was faithful to the king until the king pushed them too far and left. And you have Gandalf saying, look for me on the morning of the fifth day. I still wish it were the third day. For mythological reasons, right? Right? Morning of the third day, the sunrise. Anyway, but it's the morning of the fifth day. I went and looked. I'm like, you missed out. Could have been third. Because anyway, through the course of how awful that fighting is, awful in a good way, and how dark everything gets, you forget. Like Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas forget that Gandalf has promised because it's so dark and they're at their last stand and they're going out to die. And then Gandalf shows up. And it's just brilliant and wonderful and you love it because you remember, and they give a voice stinger, remember if you can do that, you don't need a twist. You can just make us forget by making it so dark that when the light comes back and the sun shines and the orcs are like, oh, we can't see because Gandalf might have magic, we're not sure. And they get ridden down and they're saved, you're like cheering. Whereas when Aragorn shows up the ghosts, I don't know if you guys have that. I'm like, oh good, the ghosts are there. I'm glad they didn't die. But I'm not cheering, right? Ghosts did all the work. They should have everyone should have hid and waited for the ghosts. And then the second one, you're like, oh, they had to fight every inch of the ground they gave up so that they could last long enough for Gandalf to show up. And that's what promise, progress, and payoff mean, is making this work so that you have, when these work, people cheer. People get chills. The story just is magical for a minute when this works. And when it doesn't, well, you have other things that can carry your story, but I really like this in plotting, and so that's why I talk about it. Next week, we'll talk about actual plot frameworks and strategies. Thank you guys so much.